He was never supposed to win. Nathaniel Graves had spent his entire life navigating a world that wasn't built for him, one where power belonged to men who never had to fight for it. Where wealth could buy influence but never respect. He had learned, early on, that no matter how much he built, no matter how much he earned, there would always be someone waiting to remind him that he did not belong. And then, one afternoon at JFK Airport, a flight attendant tried to do just that. She thought she could remove him from the plane like he was nothing. A minor inconvenience, just another passenger who could be dismissed without a second thought. She had no idea who she was dealing with. 24 hours later, Nathaniel Graves wasn't just booking another flight, he was buying the airline. This is a story of power, ambition, and the quiet war that never makes the headlines. How far would you go to prove you're unstoppable? Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this. Now, let's begin. It began, as these things often do, in a way that felt too small to be significant. A gesture, a tone of voice, the kind of moment that happens 1,000 times a day but is never recorded. Never given weight. It was the kind of moment that, when described, people would say, that wasn't about race, or, maybe it was just a misunderstanding. But Nathaniel Graves had lived too long, moved through too many rooms where men like him weren't welcome, to mistake what had just happened. It was a crisp afternoon at JFK. The kind of day where the world felt in motion. 1,000 different journeys crisscrossing in the air above. Nathaniel had made this trip before New York to London. An ocean away, an empire away. He had built his fortune with quiet precision. Each acquisition, each investment a careful move in a game where the rules were written to keep him from winning. And yet, he had won anyway. He carried himself like a man who did not need to prove his wealth. His suit was expensive but understated. His watch a quiet nod to success rather than a declaration. When he approached gate 23, he barely registered the woman at the counter, glancing at his ticket twice. As if she expected to see something different. He let it slide. It wasn't new. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin was a familiar world of hushed conversations and the clinking of ice in glasses. Nathaniel settled into his seat, exhaled, and let himself sink into the small peace that travel allowed. A flight was, in many ways, a pause, a moment between the expectations of one world and the demands of another. He was reading when the flight attendant appeared. "Sir, I need you to turn off your device." Nathaniel looked up. The voice was sharp, a touch too sharp. She was young, blonde, with the taut expression of someone who took rules seriously. Who believed rules were what made the world orderly and fair. She was already annoyed. "I'll turn it off," he said, his voice calm, but she was already shifting her weight. Eyes narrowing. "I need you to do it now. The thing about power is that those who have it never rush." The men Nathaniel did business with, the men who ran the world, never moved quickly unless they were afraid. He had spent his life learning that the most powerful thing a black man could do was move at his own pace. He met her eyes. He held them, and he turned off his device. But it was too late. The moment had passed, and something in her had hardened. He had not jumped at her command. And now she had to prove something. "You need to leave the plane." For a second, the words did not register. The logic of them did not align with reality. What? I'm asking you to leave. Sir. He had been in these moments before. The restaurant that suddenly had no tables. The cab that suddenly wasn't for hire. The boardroom where the deal was suddenly not the right fit. Nathaniel did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood, collected his briefcase, and stepped into the aisle. The silence was a living thing. The passengers watched with blank faces. Some glancing away, others pretending to be absorbed in their newspapers. No one spoke. No one asked why. He wanted to laugh at how predictable it was. Not the moment itself, but the response, or rather, the lack of one. As he walked toward the exit, a man in the next row shifted uncomfortably. A businessman, silver-haired, the kind of man Nathaniel had done deals with before. Their eyes met, and Nathaniel saw it, the flicker of recognition, the tiny knot of shame. But the man said nothing. Outside, in the airport terminal, the world continued. The flight would take off without him. Meredith Langley would go home and not think of him again. Nathaniel stood there, heart steady, mind already shifting gears. He did not need rage. He needed clarity. His phone buzzed. Gregory's voice, sharp and knowing. "I heard what happened. Nathaniel said nothing. Gregory exhaled. You want me to handle it? Nathaniel turned, looking out at the blinking departure boards. At the names of cities that stretched across the world. All the places he had carved his name into. The places he had made his own. No, he said slowly. I'll handle it myself. And just like that, the world began to shift. Nathaniel Graves had learned long ago that silence was rarely empty. It was, instead, a container filled with meaning, with unspoken agreements, with the weight of history pressing down on the moment. As he stood in the middle of JFK's international terminal, surrounded by travelers hurrying to places that suddenly seemed irrelevant, he could feel it, the silence, the kind of silence that was both deafening and strategic. The flight had left, he had been removed, and the world had carried on. Nathaniel adjusted the cuff of his suit, the weight of his watch, solid gold, pressed against his wrist, a small but tangible reminder of all the things he had earned, things that could be taken away at a moment's notice. Not by law, but by something older, something quieter. A security officer stood a few feet away, eyes flicking to him, then away, waiting, not approaching, not asking if he needed help, just watching. Nathaniel exhaled and moved toward the exit. He was not angry. No, anger was easy. Anger was predictable. Anger was what they expected. This required something else. It started with a single phone call. The moment he slid into the backseat of his car, his driver wordlessly pulling away from the curb, Nathaniel dialed. Gregory picked up on the first ring. Talk to me. I want the airline, Nathaniel said simply. Gregory hesitated, then chuckled a low, knowing sound. Damn, he said, not even gonna let them sweat a little? They didn't hesitate to humiliate me, Nathaniel replied. Gregory was quiet for a beat. Then, understood. I'll start moving pieces. Nathaniel ended the call and leaned back, fingers pressed against his temple. The thing about power was that it had never been about money. Not really. It had never been about who had the most resources or the largest empire. It had always been about something smaller, something more insidious. It had been about permission. Who was allowed to stand where? Who was allowed to sit comfortably? Who was allowed to exist without explanation? Without justification. Meredith Langley, that flight attendant, had believed she had the power to remove him. And in that moment, she had. But Nathaniel knew better. Money didn't mean power. Ownership did. The first call came at midnight. Nate. Gregory's voice was sharper this time. They know. Nathaniel smirked. Of course, they do. You're moving too fast. They weren't ready for this. They should have been. Gregory exhaled, something between admiration and disbelief. All right, he said, we've secured enough shares to disrupt their board. You keep pressing, and within 24 hours, they'll have to respond. Nathaniel nodded, even though Gregory couldn't see him. I want to hear them say it. Nathaniel murmured, I want to hear them explain why they thought they could treat me like that. Gregory was silent for a long moment. You know they'll never say it, he said. Nathaniel closed his eyes. I know. By sunrise, the airline's board was in free fall. Nathaniel sat in his penthouse, the city stretching out beneath him like a beast at rest, and watched the headlines spread like wildfire. Billionaire moves to buy major airline after airport incident. Power play or revenge? Nathaniel Graves' sudden takeover bid. The CEO, David Langston, had gone on the defensive immediately. His press release was predictable. This is a business matter, not a personal one. Our policies are firm. We stand by our staff. Nathaniel smirked at the words. We stand by our staff. Meredith Langley must have felt so safe in that sentence. She had played her part well, had spoken with the kind of certainty that only people like her could afford. And now, she was watching the walls close in. Nathaniel wondered how it felt. He didn't have to wonder for long. Langston called at noon. Nathaniel answered without a greeting. What the hell do you think you're doing? Langston's voice was tight, controlled, but Nathaniel could hear the desperation beneath it. I believe I'm acquiring your airline. Nathaniel replied smoothly. You think you can bully us into selling? Langston snapped. Because you got your feelings hurt? Nathaniel chuckled. No, David, I think I can buy your airline because you built it on arrogance. Because you assumed your position was untouchable. Because you thought that no matter how much money I had, no matter how much influence I wielded, you would always be able to put me in my place. Langston's silence was thick. This isn't about business, Langston finally said. This is personal. Nathaniel's voice dropped. Quiet and certain. Everything has always been personal. He ended the call. And just like that, the world began to shift. Nathaniel Graves had played this game long enough to know that the battle was never fought in the open. The real war was waged in whispers. In quiet handshakes. In the spaces where men in dark suits decided who would rise and who would be forgotten. And now, he had made himself impossible to forget. The takeover had begun. It did not start with a single strike. It started in increments, in careful, calculated moves. The men who thought themselves untouchable suddenly found their phones flooded with calls. Their investors uneasy. Their shareholders whispering in back rooms about a man who was making a move they had not prepared for. Nathaniel was not supposed to be able to do this. He was supposed to be the kind of wealthy they tolerated, not the kind that dictated terms. He was allowed in the room, but not at the head of the table. And yet, here he was. The press came first. The headlines had shifted from curiosity to alarm. Nathaniel Graves' takeover bid sparks industry panic. Billionaire's revenge or a business coup? Airline executives scrambled to respond to Graves' acquisition efforts. The coverage focused on his money, on his power, on the mechanics of the acquisition. No one spoke of the moment in the plane. No one asked why it had happened. Because that was how these things worked. It was never about the incident. It was about how much he was allowed to fight back. Then came the backlash. Nathaniel expected it, knew it was coming before the first anonymous sources began whispering to the press. Some are concerned about Graves' aggressive business tactics. Is this the kind of leadership the airline industry needs? They would never call him what they wanted to call him. But Nathaniel recognized the dog whistles. The careful framing. He had seen it before. Langston's camp leaked a statement. While we welcome investment, we believe the company's leadership must remain steady and experienced. This is not the time for reckless ambition. Nathaniel almost laughed when he read it. Reckless ambition. The irony was almost poetic. Langston had built an empire on ambition, had maneuvered his way through boardrooms filled with men who had shaped the industry to suit their own image. Who had passed seats at the table like family heirlooms. But now, a black man with money had come to claim his own. And suddenly, ambition was reckless. Nathaniel folded the newspaper and tossed it aside. He had no time for hypocrisy. The real fight began in the boardroom. By the time Nathaniel walked into the meeting, the tension was thick enough to touch. The men seated at the long oak table were not accustomed to being challenged. Their power had never been questioned before. And certainly not by someone like him. Nathaniel took his seat at the far end of the table and met each pair of eyes that tried to avoid his. Langston cleared his throat. Mr. Graves, you've made quite the entrance. Nathaniel smiled. Slow and deliberate. I like to make an impression. Langston leaned forward. Let's be honest with each other. You don't want an airline. You want a headline. This isn't your industry. Nathaniel tilted his head. And yet, here I am. Langston exhaled sharply, his patience slipping. You've made this personal. You're trying to punish us for something that. He stopped himself. But Nathaniel heard it. That hesitation. That moment where Langston almost said something he couldn't take back. For the first time, Nathaniel let his anger show. Not in words, not in volume, but in silence. Because the truth was, he wasn't trying to punish them. He was simply playing by their rules. The same rules that had been used to shut men like him out for generations. The same rules that dictated who was allowed to exist without question. Without justification. They had removed him from that plane because they believed they could. And now, he would remove them from the empire they thought was theirs. Nathaniel leaned forward, mirroring Langston's posture, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut. You don't get to decide what industries I belong in, David. Langston swallowed. Now, let's talk about how we're going to move forward. The game had changed. Nathaniel wasn't fighting for respect. He wasn't asking for it. He was taking it, and there wasn't a damn thing they could do about it. Nathaniel Graves had spent his life studying the weight of power, not the power that was written into law or printed on checks. But the power that lived in the pauses between words. In the shifts of a conversation. In the glances exchanged across a room when men thought he wasn't looking. He had spent years learning how to walk into rooms that weren't built for him and make space. He had learned how to make men twice as powerful as Langston uneasy without raising his voice. But today, he was done playing diplomat. Because power was not given. It was taken. And today, he had come to take it. The boardroom was quiet. The air held the weight of old money. Of generations of men who had learned to control the world with handshakes and private agreements. Langston sat at the head of the table. A relic of an era that had taught him to believe that his position was inevitable. That no one could challenge him without consequence. Nathaniel took his seat. Slowly. Deliberately. He wasn't in a rush. Langston cleared his throat. Nathaniel, we need to be realistic here. Nathaniel leaned back. Expression unreadable. Do we? Langston's jaw tightened. The airline is not for sale. Nathaniel smirked. It will be. Langston's fingers curled against the table. This, he inhaled sharply. Collecting himself. This is a business, not a personal battlefield. You've made your point, but you don't belong in this industry. You don't understand the complexities. The relationships. Nathaniel laughed softly, shaking his head. Relationships? He let the word settle. David, you mean the same relationships that allow certain men to fail upward? The ones that keep certain people in power while keeping others out? Langston's eyes flickered. Nathaniel leaned forward. I understand relationships. David, I understand them better than you think. I understand that every man at this table has spent his life believing that people like me exist on the outside. That no matter how much money I have, no matter how much I build, I will always need permission to enter. Silence. Nathaniel let it stretch. Let them all feel the weight of what he was saying. Then he continued, but I didn't come here to ask permission. Langston's lips pressed into a thin line. You think money is enough to take control? Nathaniel's voice was calm. I think power is. The attack came fast. Nathaniel knew it would. Within hours of leaving the boardroom, the whispers began. Anonymous sources feeding the press. Nathaniel Graves lacks experience in the airline industry. Concerns arise over the aggressive takeover attempt. Is this about business or something more? The headlines never said the quiet part out loud. They didn't have to. Nathaniel knew what they were doing. This was the oldest trick in the book. If a black man walked into power too confidently, too decisively, he was not a businessman. He was angry. He was reckless. He was a threat. They would never say it outright. But they would frame the story in a way that made the message clear. Nathaniel Graves was stepping out of place. And now, they had to put him back where he belonged. He expected resistance. He did not expect sabotage. At midnight, Gregory called. His voice was clipped, controlled, but Nathaniel could hear the urgency underneath. They're moving against us. Nathaniel sat up. How? They're shutting down your funding sources. Investors are getting calls, being warned off. Some of your key financial backers are being pressured to pull out. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. And? Gregory hesitated. They're trying to push a regulatory review. Nathaniel's hand tightened around his glass. A review? He repeated. Gregory sighed. They're trying to paint you as unfit. They're pressuring regulators to block your bid, claiming concerns about your ability to lead a major airline. Nathaniel let out a quiet, bitter laugh. Concerns? Yeah. Nathaniel set his drink down. Who's leading the charge? Gregory's voice was tight. Langston. Of course. Nathaniel sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the moment pressing down. He had known this would happen. He had seen it before. Had felt it in the air when Langston looked at him across the boardroom table. This was never going to be about business. It was about who was allowed to sit in the seat of power. And now, Langston was trying to remind him of the rules. But Nathaniel Graves had never been a man who followed their rules. At dawn, he made his move. Before Langston had time to tighten his grip. Before the investors had a chance to scatter. Nathaniel went public. He sat before the cameras. The press gathered in front of him. And looked into the eyes of a country that still did not know what to do with men like him. My bid for this airline is not just about business, he said. A hush fell over the room. This is about power. About who gets to hold it. About who is allowed to build. To grow. To take up space in industries that have long been controlled by the same hands. The reporters scribbled furiously. I was removed from that plane because someone believed they could remove me. And now, they are trying to remove me from this deal for the same reason. He let the words hang in the air. He was making them uncomfortable. Good. They won't say it out loud. They never do. He leaned forward. But we all know what this is. He had taken the battle out of the boardroom and placed it in the public eye. Now, Langston could not fight in the shadows. Now, the whole world was watching. And the war was just beginning. The world had changed since Nathaniel Graves was a boy. But not in the way people like to believe. It had gotten slicker, more polished, more efficient in its cruelty. There were no signs in the windows anymore. No laws that said where a man could and could not sit. The battle lines had been redrawn not on streets or lunch counters, but in corner offices and boardrooms. In legal loopholes and well-timed phone calls. They didn't call it racism anymore. They called it business. And Nathaniel Graves was watching them use that business to shut him out. The first blow came at dawn. Nathaniel's legal team had spent the night preparing documents, gathering statements, consolidating assets. Every move had been precise, methodical, the way a general prepares for war. But before they could make their next strike, the regulators arrived. It was no coincidence. Two men in dark suits, carrying official-looking papers, stepping into his office with the self-assurance of men who had never once been told no. Gregory was already there, seated beside Nathaniel, his face unreadable. The taller of the two men adjusted his tie. "Mr. Graves, we're here on behalf of the Federal Aviation Administration. We have some concerns about your recent acquisition attempt." Nathaniel gestured toward the papers. "Go on." The man cleared his throat. "We've received multiple reports questioning the financial structure of your bid. There are concerns about whether this takeover is in the best interest of the industry. Given your lack of direct experience in aviation." Nathaniel's laugh was low, sharp. "Lack of experience." Gregory shifted beside him. "That's an interesting argument," he said smoothly. "Since Mr. Graves has spent his entire career making acquisitions in multiple industries. He's taken failing corporations and turned them into market leaders." The other man, older, silver-haired, gave a practiced smile. "Aviation is different." Nathaniel met his gaze. "Is it?" The man didn't flinch. "We're simply ensuring that all proper procedures are followed." And there it was. The reminder. Nathaniel was playing a game he wasn't supposed to win. His bid was too ambitious. His approach too aggressive. His success too much. Too fast. They weren't trying to stop him. They were trying to slow him down. By noon, the real war began. Nathaniel's face was everywhere. News anchors dissected his takeover attempt with the kind of careful language that pretended to be neutral but was anything but. Is Nathaniel Graves overreaching? Concerns over corporate stability as Billionaire moves on major airline. Aggressive business tactics raise eyebrows in aviation industry. And the worst one, is Graves making this about race? Nathaniel sat in his office, watching the headlines roll in, the air thick with unspoken truths. They had framed the battle before he could. He was no longer a businessman. He was a problem. The whispers had reached the investors. And one by one, they began to waver. Nathaniel's phone buzzed. "Gregory, they're pulling out," Gregory said. Nathaniel exhaled. "Who?" "Two major backers." A pause. "They're citing instability in the deal. But you and I both know what this is." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, eyes on the city skyline. It had been easy when it was just about money. Money was a language everyone spoke. But now, they were making it about him. Not his business, not his plan. Him, his presence, his face. The fact that he had dared to think he could walk into their world and take something that was never meant for him. And suddenly, the rules had changed. That night, Nathaniel made his choice. He could retreat, sell off his shares, let them win, let them believe they had beaten him back into place. That he had tried and failed. Like so many others before him. Or, he could burn the whole damn game down. By morning, the headlines had changed. Nathaniel made sure of it. He called the press, not through a spokesman, not through a pre-written statement. He sat in front of a camera, adjusted his cuffs, and told the truth. "The reason they don't want me in this industry isn't about money," he said, his voice steady. "They don't care how much I have. They don't care about my experience. What they care about is control." The reporters leaned forward. "They're not fighting my business plan," Nathaniel continued. "They're fighting the idea of someone like me making decisions that affect them. They don't want me in the room. Because if I'm in the room, then suddenly, they don't get to decide the rules anymore." He let the words sink in. Then he smiled, slow and certain. "I'm not asking for permission." A pause. "I'm taking what's mine." The city held its breath. Within hours, the conversation had shifted. Some called him reckless. Others called him a disruptor. But no one ignored him. Nathaniel Graves had forced them to see him. And now, there was no turning back. Langston would fight harder. The regulators would press more. The investors would be afraid. But none of them realized. Nathaniel had already decided. He was not going to lose. Nathaniel Graves had spent his entire life preparing for this moment. Not this exact battle, not this specific war, but the inevitability of it. He had known, since he was a boy, that no matter how much money he made, no matter how many rooms he walked into wearing the right suit and shaking the right hands, there would always come a time when someone somewhere would remind him that the world still saw him as an intruder. That time had come, and now, it was his turn to remind them who he was. The first shot came at dawn. Nathaniel was in his penthouse, standing before the floor-to-ceiling windows. When Gregory's name flashed across his phone, they filed an injunction, Gregory said. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, something sharp beneath the surface. Nathaniel exhaled, slow and measured. Of course, they did. Langston and his board were done playing defense. Now, they were making it official. They had called in every favor, pulled every string, and convinced the courts to put a hold on Nathaniel's acquisition. On paper, it was about regulations, about ensuring stability, about due diligence. But Nathaniel knew what it really was. It was a stalling tactic. It was fear, and fear made men dangerous. By noon, the headlines had turned. They had moved past his money, past his tactics, past the business itself. Now, they were coming for him. The limits of power. Is Nathaniel Graves out of his depth? The business world questions whether Graves is ready for this level of leadership. Is he a visionary or a tyrant? Nathaniel sat at his desk, scanning the headlines with a quiet, simmering rage. There was nothing new here. He had seen it before. The moment a black man in power stopped being entertaining, stopped being useful, stopped playing by their rules, he became a threat. He became the problem. And when that happened, the world moved quickly to remind him where the boundaries were. Nathaniel had spent his life walking along those boundaries, stepping just close enough to test them but never close enough to be burned. But now, they were trying to shove him back. And Nathaniel had never been a man who stepped backward. The counterattack began at midnight. Gregory's team had spent the day gathering information, making calls, pressing. By the time Nathaniel dialed Gregory's number, the groundwork was already in place. I want names, Nathaniel said. Gregory didn't ask which names. He already knew. Langston hadn't built his empire on clean deals and honest negotiations. He had cut throats to get where he was. And now, Nathaniel was going to remind him what it felt like to bleed. The walls began to crack. The next morning, the first leaks hit the press. A whispered scandal about Langston's backdoor deals. Allegations of misconduct. Old grievances from employees who had been silenced, suddenly finding their way into public view. And then, the audit. Nathaniel hadn't just bought stock. He had bought access. And access meant pulling back the curtain on how Langston had really been running his company. By noon, news outlets were reporting serious financial irregularities within the airline. By evening, investors were running. And by the end of the night, the board was divided. Langston had spent years building his fortress. Nathaniel had spent weeks turning it into a house of cards. Then came the final blow. The moment Nathaniel had been waiting for. The board fractured. Uncertain, desperate, called an emergency meeting. Langston was fighting, clawing, trying to hold on. But Nathaniel had done what he came to do. He had broken them. And as he sat across from Langston in that boardroom, watching the panic settle behind the man's eyes, Nathaniel allowed himself something rare. A smile. Because for the first time, Langston understood. This was no longer his airline. This was Nathaniel's. And there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Power wasn't given. It was taken. Nathaniel had taken it. And now, the world would never forget his name. Nathaniel Graves had won. At least, that's what the headlines said. Nathaniel Graves forces out Langston in landmark takeover. Billionaire reshapes aviation industry with unprecedented business move. Corporate coup or bold vision? Nathaniel Graves claims victory. The newspapers framed it as a power struggle, a financial chess match, a clash of titans. But Nathaniel knew better. This had never been about money. This had never been about corporate dominance. This had been about who was allowed to hold power. And that battle, that war, was far from over. Langston did not go quietly. Nathaniel had expected resistance. But this was something else. Langston wasn't just fighting to keep his position, he was fighting to rewrite the story. The accusations came quickly, slipping into the media like whispers through a closed door. Nathaniel Graves' leadership questioned amid takeover controversy. Is this the right man to lead the airline? Some employees expressed concern over Graves' aggressive business tactics. Nathaniel knew exactly what they were doing. They couldn't stop him from taking the company. So they would poison it. They would make the world question whether he belonged. They would chip away at his legitimacy until the power he had taken felt fragile. It was an old game. The same game that had been played against every black man who had dared to take. He had seen it before. The way a man could build an empire and still be asked if he was capable. The way his expertise could be questioned. His authority diminished. His presence tolerated but never fully accepted. Nathaniel had spent his life fighting for space. And now they were trying to shrink him. The first real test came from inside. Nathaniel sat at the head of the long, polished boardroom table, facing the very people he had just conquered. The remaining executives, Langston's men, the ones who had stayed out of the fight, waiting to see who would win, were watching him carefully. They were waiting for him to fail. Nathaniel met their eyes. I know what you're thinking, he said, his voice smooth, steady. You think this company is going to fall apart because I took it from Langston. No one spoke, but let me make something clear. He leaned forward slightly. Langston didn't build this airline. He maintained it. He didn't innovate. He protected himself. That's what you all want to do, isn't it? Silence. Nathaniel let it stretch. I didn't come here to maintain. I came here to make this airline something bigger. Something stronger. And if you can't handle that, then you should leave now. The room remained still. Then one man, an older executive with gray at his temples and a voice like gravel, spoke. We just want to know if you can handle it. Nathaniel's eyes locked onto his. You're not asking if I can handle it, he said quietly. You're asking if I can handle you. The man stiffened. Nathaniel leaned back. Let me put your fears to rest, he said. You are no longer in control. I am. And just like that, the room belonged to him. The second test came from the employees. Nathaniel had been prepared for their resistance. He knew how this worked. When a black man took charge, there were always murmurs. Always. Some were afraid. Some were skeptical. Some were waiting to see if the rumors were true that he was too ruthless, too cold, too angry. He walked the floors of the company, listening to the whispers, watching the glances exchanged when they thought he wasn't looking. Some people were openly hostile. Meredith Langley, the flight attendant who had started it all, was still employed. Nathaniel had considered firing her outright. But no, her removal needed to come later, in a way that left no room for questions. For now, she walked the halls with a carefully controlled expression, her posture stiff, her mouth pressed into a thin line. She hated him. He knew it. She was waiting for the moment when he would fail. She wasn't alone, and that was fine. Nathaniel had never needed anyone to believe in him. He just needed them to understand one thing. He was not leaving. The third test came from outside. Nathaniel was in his office when Gregory walked in, his face unreadable. You need to see this. Nathaniel took the tablet from his hands. The article was fresh, the ink barely dry. Anonymous sources reveal concerns over Nathaniel Graves' leadership style. Anonymous. Nathaniel already knew the game before he finished reading. They had tried to stop him and failed. Now, they were going to erode him. A death by 1,000 cuts. The article was laced with words that never said exactly what they meant. Concerns over his ability to lead. Fears that his approach may alienate key figures. Some question whether he understands the complexities of this industry. Nathaniel clenched his jaw. He knew how this ended. They would keep planting these stories. They would feed the uncertainty. Make it real simply by repeating it over and over until the world believed it. Until even he started to question whether he had won at all. Gregory watched him carefully. What do you want to do? Nathaniel exhaled. Then he smiled. Let's give them something to talk about. By nightfall, the war had escalated. Nathaniel did not go on defense. Instead, he went to the press. He did not play their game. He did not issue a statement filled with meaningless pleasantries. He sat down in front of the camera. And he spoke the truth. I have built companies from the ground up, he said, his voice steady. I have turned failing industries into success stories. I have done what men like Langston could never do, not because I wasn't capable, but because I was never supposed to. The journalist sat in stunned silence. I know what's being said about me. Nathaniel continued. I know what they are trying to do. They are afraid that I have taken something they never thought I could. And now, they want me to apologize for it. A pause. I won't. The broadcast went viral before it even finished. By morning, there were new headlines. Nathaniel Graves fires back at critics. Defiant and unapologetic, Graves refuses to back down. Nathaniel sat in his office, watching the world react. Some called him bold, some called him dangerous, but no one could ignore him now. And that was the real victory. Because power was not just about winning. It was about making sure that no one could ever take it away again. And Nathaniel Graves had just ensured that they never would. The weight of victory was heavier than Nathaniel Graves had expected. The world had changed, not in the way that men wrote about in newspapers. Not in the way that history recorded, but in the way that only those who had lived long enough to see it shift could understand. Power had always belonged to men like Langston. Men who could walk into any room and be assumed competent, be assumed deserving, be assumed right. But now, Nathaniel sat in his chair. And the world was watching. The first crack came from within. Nathaniel was in his office when Gregory stormed in. A rare look of frustration on his face. We have a problem, Gregory said. Nathaniel sighed. Only one? Gregory tossed a folder onto the desk. Employees. Resistance. The old guard is pushing back harder than we expected. Nathaniel flipped through the papers, his jaw tightening as he read. Anonymous complaints. Leaked memos. Concerns over Nathaniel Graves' leadership. A shift too drastic, too fast. Some worry the company is losing its identity. Nathaniel chuckled dryly. Losing its identity? They mean Langston's identity, Gregory muttered. Nathaniel leaned back in his chair. So that's how they want to play this. It was never enough for men like Langston to lose. They had to ensure that their absence was felt, that the walls trembled, that the very foundation of the house shook when they left. And if they could convince enough people that Nathaniel was the wrong man for the job, that he was the instability, the threat, then it wouldn't matter that he had won. They would simply wait him out. Wait until he tired. Wait until the pressure became too much. Wait until he walked away. Nathaniel closed the folder. He had never been a man who walked away. The second crack came from the press. The headlines had been relentless. A leadership in crisis? Nathaniel Graves faces backlash as employees push back. Was Langston right? Nathaniel had expected backlash. But this was coordinated. This was an attack. He had spent years learning how the media framed black men in power. If he was quiet, he was weak. If he was decisive, he was dangerous. If he was strategic, he was manipulative. There was no way to win their game. So Nathaniel decided to stop playing it. The third crack came from the boardroom. Nathaniel walked into the meeting knowing that everything was riding on this. Langston might have been gone, but his shadow still loomed large. Half the men in the room had built their careers under him. They had learned under him. And now, they were sitting across from his replacement. A black man who had taken the company from them instead of waiting for permission. Nathaniel could see it in their eyes. They didn't trust him. They were waiting for him to fail. Langston's closest allies sat stiffly, their hands folded, their gazes cool. One of them, a gray-haired man named Warren Fields, finally spoke. We're concerned, Nathaniel. His voice was measured, polite. Nathaniel met his gaze. Concerned about what? Warren glanced at the others before speaking again. The company is struggling with morale. Employees are uncertain about your leadership. Investors are nervous. And now, the media is circling. Perhaps this transition has been too abrupt. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. There it was. The beginning of the coup. They were laying the groundwork, planting the seeds. If he stumbled just once, they would be ready to pull him down. Nathaniel's voice was calm, but his words cut like steel. You're not concerned about the company, Warren. You're concerned about me. A murmur passed through the room. Nathaniel didn't let them interrupt. You're waiting for me to fail. You want to tell yourselves that this was a mistake. That Langston was the only man who could lead this airline. But let me remind you of something. He leaned forward, his voice dropping just enough to make them listen. Langston didn't lose this company. He gave it away. Through bad business. Through complacency. Through arrogance. I didn't take this from him. He left it unguarded. Silence. And if any of you believe that I don't belong here, Nathaniel said slowly, then you're free to leave. No one moved. Because power was not given. It was taken. And Nathaniel had just reminded them who held it now. The final crack came from Meredith Langley. She had waited. Waited for the tide to turn. Waited for the right moment. And now, she saw her opportunity. She stood in the hallway as Nathaniel left the boardroom. Her posture stiff. Her lips pressed together. She had been silent for weeks. Keeping her head down. Watching. Waiting. Now, she spoke. Sir. Nathaniel stopped. Meredith lifted her chin. There's something you should know. Nathaniel studied her. Go on. Her fingers curled at her sides. There are people in this company who will never accept you. Nathaniel smirked. I know. Her eyes darkened. Then why are you still here? Nathaniel let the silence stretch between them before answering. Because men like me don't get the luxury of walking away. Meredith's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to argue. But she didn't. She knew he was right. And as Nathaniel walked past her, he knew that this was the end of something and the beginning of something else. Power is never permanent. It shifts. It breaks. It reforms itself. Nathaniel Graves had taken his seat. But the war would never be over. Not for him. Not for men like him. But for now. For this moment. He had won. And that was enough.